This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in February 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 17. In about a minute, somebody spoke out of a window without putting his head out and says, "Be done, boys. Who's there?" I says, "It's me." "Who's me?" "George Jackson, sir." "What do you want?" "I don't want nothing, sir. I only want to go along by, but the dogs won't let me." "What are you prowling around here this time of night for, hey?" "I warn't prowling around, sir. I fell overboard off of the steamboat." "Oh, you did you? Strike a light there, somebody. What did you say your name was?" "George Jackson, sir. I'm only a boy." "Look here. If you're telling the truth, you needn't to be afraid. Nobody'll hurt you. But don't try to budge. Stand right where you are. Rouse out Bob and Tom, some of you, and fetch the guns. George Jackson, is there anybody with you?" "No, sir, nobody." I heard the people stirring around in the house now, and see a light. The man sung out, "Snatch that light away, Betsy, you old fool. Ain't you got any sense? Put it on the floor behind the front door. Bob, if you and Tom are ready, take your places." "All ready." "Now, George Jackson, do you know the Shepherdsons?" "No, sir, I never heard of them." "Well, that may be so, and it mayn't. Now, all ready. Step forward, George Jackson. And mind, don't you hurry, come mighty slow. If there's anybody with you, let him keep back. If he shows himself, he'll be shot. Come along now. Come slow. Push the door open yourself. Just enough to squeeze in, do you hear?" I didn't hurry. I couldn't if I'd 'a' wanted to. I took one slow step at a time, and there weren't a sound, only I thought I could hear my heart. The dogs were as still as the humans, but they followed a little behind me. When I got to the 3 log doorsteps, I heard them unlocking and unbarring and unbolting. I put my hand on the door and pushed it a little more, till somebody said, "There, that's enough. Put your head in." I done it, but I judged they would take it off. The candle was on the floor, and there they all was looking at me, and me at them, for about a quarter of a minute. 3 big men with guns pointed at me, which made me wince, I tell you. The oldest gray and about 60, the other 2 30 or more, all of them fine and handsome, and the sweetest old gray-headed lady, and back of her 2 young women which I couldn't see right well. The old gentleman says, "There, I reckon it's all right. Come in." As soon as I was in, the old gentleman, he locked the door and barred it and bolted it, and told the young men to come in with their guns, and they all went in a big parlor that had a new rag carpet on the floor, and got together in a corner that was out of the range of the front windows. There weren't none on the side. They held the candle and took a good look at me, and all said, "Why, he ain't a Shepherdson. No, there ain't any Shepherdson about him." Then the old man said he hoped I wouldn't mind being searched for arms, because he didn't mean no harm by it. It was only to make sure. So he didn't pry into my pockets, but only felt outside with his hands, and said it was all right. He told me to make myself easy and at home, and tell all about myself. But the old lady says, "Why, bless you, Saul, the poor thing's as wet as he can be, and don't you reckon it may be he's hungry?" "True for you, Rachel, I forgot." So the old lady says, "Betsy," this was a nigger woman, "you fly around and get him something to eat as quick as you can, poor thing, and one of you girls go and wake up Buck and tell him, oh, here he is himself. Buck, take this little stranger and get the wet clothes off from him and dress him up in some of yours that's dry." Buck looked about as old as me, 13 or 14 or along there, though he was a little bigger than me. He hadn't on anything but a shirt, and he was very frowsy-headed. He came in gaping and digging one fist into his eye, and he was dragging a gun along with the other one. He says, "Ain't they no Sheppersons around?" They said no, 'twas a false alarm. "Well," he says, "if they'd a been some, I reckon I'd a got one." They all laughed, and Bob says, "Why, Buck, they might have scalped us all, you've been so slow in comin'." "Well, nobody come after me, and it ain't right I'm always kept down. I don't get no show." "Never mind, Buck, my boy," says the old man. "You'll have show enough, all in good time, don't you fret about that. Go along with you now, and do as your mother told you." When we got upstairs to his room, he got me a coarse shirt and a roundabout and pants of his, and I put them on. While I was at it, he asked me what my name was, but before I could tell him, he started to tell me about a blue jay and a young rabbit he had catched in the woods day before yesterday, and asked me where Moses was when the candle went out. I said I didn't know, I hadn't heard about it before, no way. "Well, guess," he says. "How am I going to guess," says I, "when I never heard tell of it before?" "But you can guess, can't you? It's just as easy." "Which candle?" I says. "Why, any candle," he says. "I don't know where he was," says I. "Where was he?" "Why, he was in the dark. That's where he was." "Well, if you knowed where he was, what did you ask me for?" "Why, blame it, it's a riddle, don't you see? Say, how long are you going to stay here? You got to stay always. We can just have boomin' times. They don't have no school now. Do you own a dog? I've got a dog, and he'll go in the river and bring out chips that you throw in. Do you like to comb up Sundays and all that kind of foolishness? You bet I don't, but Ma, she makes me. Confound these old breeches. I reckon I'd better put 'em on, but I'd ruther not, it's so warm. Are you all ready? All right. Come along, old hoss." Cold corn pone, cold corned beef, butter and buttermilk. That is what they had for me down there, and there ain't nothing better that ever I've come across yet. Buck and his ma and all of them smoked cob pipes, except the nigger woman, which was gone, and the two young women. They all smoked and talked, and I eat and talked. The young women had quilts around them, and their hair down their backs. They all asked me questions, and I told them how Pap and me and all the family was living on a little farm down at the bottom of Arkansas, and my sister Mary Ann run off and got married and never was heard of no more, and Bill went to hunt them, and he weren't heard of no more, and Tom and Mort died, and then there weren't nobody but just me and Pap left, and he was just trimmed down to nothing on account of his troubles. So when he died, I took what there was left, because the farm didn't belong to us, and started up the river, deck passage, and fell overboard, and that was how I come to be here. So they said I could have a home there as long as I wanted it. Then it was most daylight, and everybody went to bed. And I went to bed with Buck, and when I waked up in the morning, drat it all, I had forgot what my name was. So I laid there about an hour trying to think, and when Buck waked up, I says, "Can you spell, Buck?" "Yes," he says. "I bet you can't spell my name," says I. "I bet you what, you dare I can," says he. "All right," says I, "go ahead." Georgejackson. There now, he says. "Well," says I, "you done it, but I didn't think you could. It ain't no slouch of a name to spell, right off without studying." I set it down private, because somebody might want me to spell it next, and so I wanted to be handy with it, and rattle it off like I was used to it. It was a mighty nice family, and a mighty nice house, too. I hadn't seen no house out in the country before that was so nice and had so much style. It didn't have an iron latch on the front door, nor a wooden one with a buckskin string, but a brass knob to turn, the same as houses in town. There weren't no bed in the parlor, nor a sign of a bed, but heaps of parlors in towns has beds in them. There was a big fireplace that was bricked on the bottom, and the bricks was kept clean and red by pouring water on them and scrubbing them with another brick. Sometimes they wash them over with red water paint they call Spanish brown, same as they do in town. They had big brass dog irons that could hold up a saw log. There was a clock on the middle of the mantelpiece with a picture of a town painted on the bottom half of the glass front, and a round place in the middle of it for the sun, and you could see the pendulum swinging behind it. It was beautiful to hear that clock tick, and sometimes when one of these peddlers had been along and scoured her up and got her in good shape, she would start in and strike 150 before she got tuckered out. They wouldn't take any money for her. Well, there was a big outlandish parrot on each side of the clock, made out of something like chalk and painted up gaudy. By one of the parrots was a cat made of crockery, and a crockery dog by the other. When you pressed down on them, they squeaked, but didn't open their mouths nor look different nor interested. They squeaked through underneath. There was a couple of big wild turkey wing fans spread out behind those things. On the table in the middle of the room was kind of a lovely crockery basket that had apples and oranges and peaches and grapes piled up in it, which was much redder and yellower and prettier than real ones is, but they weren't real because you could see where pieces had got chipped off and showed the white chalk, or whatever it was, underneath. This table had a cover made out of beautiful oilcloth, with a red and blue spread eagle painted on it, and a painted border all round. It come all the way from Philadelphia, they said. There were some books, too, piled up perfectly exact on each corner of the table. One was a big family Bible, full of pictures. One was Pilgrim's Progress, about a man that left his family. It didn't say why. I read considerable in it now and then. The statements was interestin', but tough. Another was Friendship's Offerin', full of beautiful stuff and poetry, but I didn't read the poetry. Another was Henry Clay's speeches, and another was Dr. Gunn's Family Medicine, which told you all about what to do if a body was sick or dead. There was a hymn book and a lot of other books, and there was nice split-bottom chairs and perfectly sound, too, not bagged down in the middle and busted like an old basket. They had pictures hung on the walls, mainly Washingtons and Lafayettes and Battles and Highland Marys, and one called Singin' the Declaration. There was some that they called crayons, which one of the daughters which was dead made her own self when she was only 15 years old. They was different from any pictures I ever see before. Blacker mostly than is common. One was a woman in a slim black dress, belted small under the armpits, with bulges like a cabbage in the middle of the sleeves, and a large black scoop-shovel bonnet with a black veil, and white slim ankles crossed about with black tape, and very wee black slippers like a chisel, and she was leaning pensive on a tombstone on her right elbow, under a weeping willow, and her other hand hanging down her side holding a white handkerchief and a reticule, and underneath the picture it said, "Shall I never see thee more, alas?" Another was a young woman with her hair all combed up straight to the top of her head and knotted there in front of a comb like a chair-back, and she was crying into a handkerchief and had a dead bird laying on its back in her other hand with its heels up, and underneath the picture it said, "I shall never hear thy sweet chirrup more, alas." There was one more where a young lady was at a window looking up at the moon, and tears running down her cheeks, and she had an open letter in one hand with black sealing wax showing on one edge of it, and she was mashing a locket with a chain to it against her mouth, and underneath the picture it said, "And art thou gone? Yes, thou art gone, alas." These was all nice pictures, I reckon, but I didn't somehow seem to take to them, because if ever I was down a little, they always give me the fantides. Everybody was sorry she died, because she had laid out a lot more of these pictures to do, and a body could see by what she had done what they had lost. But I reckon with her disposition, she was having a better time in the graveyard. She was at work on what they said was her greatest picture when she took sick, and every day and every night it was her prayer to be allowed to live till she got it done. But she never got the chance. It was a picture of a young woman in a long white gown, standing on the rail of a bridge, all ready to jump off, with her hair all down her back, and looking up to the moon with the tears running down her face, and she had 2 arms folded across her breast, and 2 arms stretched out in front, and 2 more reaching up towards the moon, and the idea was to see which pair would look best and then scratch out all the other arms. But as I was saying, she died before she got her mind made up, and now they kept this picture over the head of the bed in her room, and every time her birthday come, they hung flowers on it. Other times it was hid with a little curtain. The young woman in the picture had a kind of nice sweet face, but there were so many arms it made her look too spidery, seemed to me. This young girl kept a scrapbook when she was alive, and used to paste obituaries and accidents and cases of patients suffering in it out of the Presbyterian Observer, and write poetry after them out of her own head. It was very good poetry. This is what she wrote about a boy by the name of Stephen Dowling Botts that fell down a well and was drownded. Ode to Stephen Dowling Botts, deceased. And did young Stephen sicken? And did young Stephen die? And did the sad hearts thicken? And did the mourners cry? No, such was not the fate of young Stephen Dowling Botts. Though sad hearts round him thickened, 'twas not from sickness's shots. No whooping cough did rack his frame, nor measles drear with spots. Not these impaired the sacred name of Stephen Dowling Botts. Despised love struck not with woe that head of curly knots, nor stomach troubles laid him low, young Stephen Dowling Botts. Oh no, then list with tearful eye, whilst I his fate do tell. His soul did from this cold world fly, by falling down a well. They got him out and emptied him. Alas, it was too late. His spirit was gone for to sport aloft in the realms of the good and great. If Emmeline Grangerfield could make poetry like that before she was 14, there ain't no telling what she could have done by and by. Buck said she could rattle off poetry like nothing. She didn't ever have to stop to think. He said she would slap down a line, and if she couldn't find anything to rhyme with it, would just scratch it out and slap down another one and go ahead. She weren't particular. She could write about anything you choose to give her to write about, just so it was sadful. Every time a man died, or a woman died, or a child died, she would be on hand with her tribute before he was cold. She called them tributes. The neighbor said it was the doctor first, then Emmeline, then the undertaker. The undertaker never got in ahead of Emmeline but once, and then she hung fire on a rhyme for the dead person's name, which was Whistler. She warn't ever the same after that. She never complained, but she kinder pined away and did not live long. Poor thing, many's the time I made myself go up to the little room that used to be hers and get out her poor old scrapbook and read in it when her pictures had been aggravating me and I had soured on her a little. I liked all that family, dead ones and all, and weren't going to let anything come between us. Poor Emmeline made poetry about all the dead people when she was alive, and it didn't seem right that there warn't nobody to make some about her now she was gone. So I tried to sweat out a verse or two myself, but I couldn't seem to make it go somehow. They kept Emmeline's room trim and nice, and all the things fixed in it just the way she liked to have them when she was alive, and nobody ever slept there. The old lady took care of the room herself, though there was plenty of niggers, and she sewed there a good deal and read her Bible there mostly. Well, as I was saying about the parlor, there was beautiful curtains on the windows, white, with pictures painted on them of castles with vines all down the walls, and cattle coming down to drink. There was a little old piano, too, that had tin pans in it, I reckon, and nothing was ever so lovely as to hear the young ladies sing "The Last Link is Broken" and play "The Battle of Prague" on it. The walls of all the rooms was plastered, and most had carpets on the floors, and the whole house was whitewashed on the outside. It was a double house, and the big open place betwixt them was roofed and floored, and sometimes the table was set there in the middle of the day, and it was a cool, comfortable place. Nothing couldn't be better. And weren't the cooking good? And just bushels of it, too. End of chapter 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in February 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 18. Colonel Grangerford was a gentleman, you see. He was a gentleman all over, and so was his family. He was well born, as the saying is, and that's worth as much in a man as it is in a horse, so the widow Douglas said, and nobody ever denied that she was of the first aristocracy in our town. And Pap, he always said it too, though he warn't no more quality than a mudcat himself. Colonel Grangerford was very tall and very slim, and had a darkish paley complexion, not a sign of red in it anywheres. He was clean-shaved every morning all over his thin face, and he had the thinnest kind of lips, and the thinnest kind of nostrils, and a high nose and heavy eyebrows, and the blackest kind of eyes, sunk so deep back that they seemed like they was looking out of caverns at you, as you may say. His forehead was high, and his hair was black and straight and hung to his shoulders. His hands was long and thin, and every day of his life he put on a clean shirt and a full suit from head to foot, made out of linen so white it hurt your eyes to look at it, and on Sundays he wore a blue tailcoat with brass buttons on it. He carried a mahogany cane with a silver head to it. There warn't no frivolousness about him, not a bit, and he warn't ever loud. He was as kind as he could be. You could feel that, you know, and so you had confidence. Sometimes he smiled, and it was good to see. But when he straightened himself up like a liberty pole, and the lightning begun to flicker out from under his eyebrows, you wanted to climb a tree first and find out what the matter was afterwards. He didn't ever have to tell anybody to mind their manners. Everybody was always good-mannered where he was. Everybody loved to have him around, too. He was sunshine most always. I mean, he made it seem like good weather. When he turned into a cloud bank, it was awful dark for half a minute, and that was enough. There wouldn't nothing go wrong again for a week. When him and the old lady come down in the morning, all the family got up out of their chairs and give them good day, and didn't set down again till they had set down. Then Tom and Bob went to the sideboard, where the decanter was, and mixed a glass of bitters, and handed it to him, and he held it in his hand and waited till Tom's and Bob's was mixed, and then they bowed and said, "Our duty to you, sir and madam," and they bowed the least bit in the world, and said thank you, and so they drank all three, and Bob and Tom poured a spoonful of water in the sugar and the mite of whiskey or apple brandy in the bottom of their tumblers, and give it to me and Buck, and we drank to the old people too. Bob was the oldest, and Tom next. Tall, beautiful men, with very broad shoulders and brown faces, and long black hair and black eyes. They dressed in white linen from head to foot, like the old gentlemen, and wore broad Panama hats. Then there was Miss Charlotte. She was 25, and tall and proud and grand, about as good as she could be when she warn't stirred up, but when she was, she had a look that would make you wilt in your tracks like her father. She was beautiful. So was her sister, Miss Sophia, but it was a different kind. She was gentle and sweet like a dove, and she was only 20. Each person had their own nigger to wait on them, Buck, too. My nigger had a monstrous easy time because I warn't used to having anybody do anything for me, but Buck's was on the jump most of the time. This was all there was of the family now, but there used to be more. 3 sons they got killed, and Emmeline that died. The old gentleman owned a lot of farms and over 100 niggers. Sometimes a stack of people would come there, horseback, from 10 or 15 mile round, and stay 5 or 6 days, and have such junketings round about and on the river, and dances and picnics in the woods daytimes, and balls at the house nights. These people was mostly kinfolks of the family. The men brought their guns with them. It was a handsome lot of quality, I tell ya. There was another clan of aristocracy around there, 5 or 6 families, mostly of the same name of Shepherdson. They was as high-toned and well-born and rich and grand as the tribe of Grangerfords. The Shepherdsons and Grangerfords used the same steamboat landing, which was about 2 miles above our house, so sometimes when I went up there with a lot of our folks, I used to see a lot of the Shepherdsons there on their fine horses. One day Buck and me was away out in the woods hunting, and heard a horse comin'. We was crossin' the road. Buck says, "Quick! Jump for the woods!" We done it, and then peeped down the woods through the leaves. Pretty soon a splendid young man come gallopin' down the road, settin' his horse easy and lookin' like a soldier. He had a gun across his pommel. I had seen him before. It was young Harney Shepherdson. I heard Buck's gun go off in my ear, and Harney's hat tumbled off from his head. He grabbed his gun and rode straight to the place where we was hid. But we didn't wait. We started through the woods on a run. The woods warn't thick, so I looked over my shoulder to dodge a bullet, and twice I see Harney cover Buck with his gun, and then he rode away the way he come. To get his hat, I reckon, but I couldn't see. We never stopped running till we got home. The old gentleman's eyes blazed a minute. 'Twas pleasure mainly, I judged. Then his face sort of smoothed down, and he says, kind of gentle, "I don't like shooting from behind a bush. Why didn't you step into the road, my boy?" "The Shepherdsons don't, father. They always take advantage." Miss Charlotte, she held her head up like a queen while Buck was telling his tale, and her nostrils spread and her eyes snapped. The 2 young men looked dark, but never said nothin'. Miss Sophia, she turned pale, but the color come back when she found the man warn't hurt. Soon as I could get Buck down by the corn cribs under the tree by ourselves, I says, "Did you want to kill him, Buck?" "Well, I bet I did." "What did he do to you?" "Him? He never done nothing to me." "Well, then, what did you want to kill him for?" "Why, nothing, only it's on account of the feud." "What's a feud?" "Why, where was you raised? Don't you know what a feud is?" "Never heard of it before. Tell me about it." "Well," says Buck, "a feud is this way. A man has a quarrel with another man and kills him. Then that other man's brother kills him. Then the other brothers on both sides goes for one another. Then the cousins chip in. And by everybody's killed off, and there ain't no more feud. But it's kind of slow and takes a long time." "Has this one been going on long, Buck?" "Well, I should reckon. It started 30 year ago, or summers along there. There was trouble 'bout something, and then a lawsuit to settle it, and the suit went agin one of the men, so he up and shot the man that won the suit, which he would naturally do, of course. Anybody would." "What was the trouble about, Buck? Land?" "I reckon maybe. I don't know." "Well, who done the shooting? Was it a Grangerford or a Shepherdson?" "Laws, how do I know? It was so long ago." "Don't anybody know?" "Oh, yes, Pa knows, I reckon, and some of the other old people, but they don't know now what the row was about in the first place." "Has there been many killed, Buck?" "Yes, right smart chance of funerals, but they don't always kill. Pa's got a few buckshot in him, but he don't mind it 'cause he don't weigh much anyway. Bob's been carved up some with a bowie, and Tom's been hurt once or twice." "Has anybody been killed this year, Buck?" "Yes, we got one and they got one. 'Bout 3 months ago, my cousin Bud, 14-year-old, was riding through the woods on the other side of the river and didn't have no weapon with him, which was blame foolishness, and in a lonesome place he hears a horse a-comin' behind him, and sees old Baldy Shepherdson a-linking after him with his gun in his hand and his white hair a-flyin' in the wind. Instead of jumping off and taking to the bush, Bud 'lowed he could outrun him, so they had it nip and tuck for 5 mile or more, the old man a-gaining all the time. So at last Bud seen it warn't any use, so he stopped and faced around, so as to have the bullet holes in front, you know. And the old man, he rode up and shot him down. But he didn't get much chance to enjoy his luck, for inside of a week our folks laid him out. I reckon that old man was a coward, Buck. I reckon he warn't a coward, not by a blame sight. There ain't a coward amongst them Shepherdsons, not a one, and there ain't no cowards amongst the Grangerfords either. Why, that old man kept up his end in a fight one day for half an hour against 3 Grangerfords, and come out winner. That was all a horseback. He lit off his horse and got behind a little woodpile and kept his horse before him to stop the bullets, but the Grangerfords stayed on their horses and capered around the old man and peppered away at him, and he peppered away at them. Him and his horse both went home pretty leaky and crippled, but the Grangerfords had to be fetched home, and one of 'em was dead, and another died the next day. No, sir, if a body's out hunting for cowards, he don't want to fool away any time amongst them Shepherdsons, because they don't breed any of that kind. Next Sunday we all went to church, about 3 mile, everybody a horseback. The men took their guns along, and so did Buck, and kept them between their knees or stood them handy against the wall. The Shepherdsons done the same. It was pretty ornery preachin', all about brotherly love and such like tiresomeness, but everybody said it was a good sermon, and they all talked it over going home, and had such a powerful lot to say about faith and good works and free grace and pre-foreordination and I don't know what all, that it did seem to me to be one of the roughest Sundays I had run across yet. About an hour after dinner everybody was dozing around, some in their chairs and some in their rooms, and it got to be pretty dull. Buck and a dog was stretched out on the grass in the sun, sound asleep. I went up to our room and judged I would take a nap myself. I found that sweet Miss Sophia standing in her door, which was next to ours, and she took me in her room and shut the door very soft, and asked me if I liked her, and I said I did, and she asked me if I would do something for her and not tell anybody, and I said I would. Then she said she'd forgot her Testament, and left it in the seat at church between 2 other books, and would I slip out quiet and go there and fetch it to her, and not say nothing to nobody? I said I would, so I slid out and slipped off up the road, and there warn't anybody at the church except maybe a hog or 2, for there warn't any lock on the door, and hogs likes a punchin' floor in summertime because it's cool. If you notice, most folks don't go to church only when they've got to, but a hog is different. Says I to myself, something's up. It ain't natural for a girl to be in such a sweat about a Testament. So I give it a shake, and out drops a little piece of paper with 2:30 wrote on it with a pencil. I ransacked it, but couldn't find anything else. I couldn't make anything out of that, so I put the paper in the book again, and when I got home and upstairs, there was Miss Sophia in her door waiting for me. She pulled me in and shut the door. Then she looked in the Testament till she found the paper, and as soon as she read it she looked glad. And before a body could think, she grabbed me and give me a squeeze and said I was the best boy in the world, and not to tell anybody. She was mighty red in the face for a minute, and her eyes lighted up, and it made her powerful pretty. I was a good deal astonished, but when I got my breath I asked her what the paper was about, and she asked me if I had read it, and I said no, and she asked me if I could read writin', and I told her no, only coarse hand. And then she said the paper warn't anything but a bookmark to keep her a place, and I might go and play now. I went off down to the river, studying over this thing, and pretty soon I noticed that my nigger was following along behind. When we was out of sight of the house, he looked back and around a second, and then comes a-running and says, "Marse George, if you'll come down into the swamp, I'll show you a whole stack of water moccasins. Thinks I, that's mighty curious. He said that yesterday. He ought ter know body don't love water moccasins enough to go around hunting for them. What is he up to, anyway? So I says, all right, trot ahead. I followed a half-mile. Then he struck out over the swamp and waded ankle-deep as much as another half-mile. We come to a little flat piece of land which was dry, and very thick with trees and bushes and vines, and he says, "You shove right in there just a few steps, Mars George. Dat's where dey is. I seed 'em before. I don't keer to see 'em no more." Then he slopped right along and went away, and pretty soon the trees hid him. I poked into the place a ways and come to a little open patch as big as a bedroom, all hung around with vines, and found a man layin' there asleep. And by jings, it was my old Jim. I waked him up, and I reckoned it was going to be a grand surprise to him to see me again, but it warn't. He nearly cried, he was so glad, but he warn't surprised. Said he swum along behind me that night and heard me yell every time, but doesn't answer, because he didn't want nobody to pick him up and take him into slavery again. Says he, "I got hurt a little and couldn't swim fast, so I was considerable ways behind you towards the last. When you landed, I reckoned I could ketch up with you on the land 'thout having to shout at you, but when I see that house I begin to go slow. I is off too fur to hear what they say to you. I was afraid of the dogs, but when it was all quiet again, I knowed you's in the house, so I struck out for the woods to wait for day. Early in the morning some of the niggers come along, gwine to the fields, and they took me and showed me this place, where the dogs can't track me on accounts of the water, and they brings me truck to eat every night, and tells me how you's a-getting along." "Why didn't you tell my Jack to fetch me here sooner, Jim?" "Well, 'twarn't no use to disturb you, Huck, till we could do something, but we's all right now. I been a-buying pots and pans and vittles, and I got a chancet and a-patching up the raft nights when—" "What raft, Jim?" "Our old raft." "You mean to say our old raft warn't smashed all to flinders?" "No, she warn't. She was tore up a good deal. One end of her was, but they warn't no great harm done, only our traps was most all lost. If we hadn't dived so deep and swum so fur under water, and the night hadn't been so dark, and we weren't so skeered, and been such pumpkin heads as the sayin' is, we'd 'a' seed the raft. But it's just as well we didn't, 'cause now she's all fixed up again most as good as new, and we's got a new lot of stuff in the place of what is lost." "Why, how did you get hold of the raft again, Jim? Did you catch her?" "How I goin' to ketch her and I out in the woods? No, some of the niggers found her ketched on a snag along here in the bend, and they hid her in a crick 'mongst the willows, and they was so much jawin' about which on 'em she belonged to the most that I come to hear about it pretty soon, so I ups and settles the trouble by tellin' 'em she don't belong to none of 'em, but to you and me, and I asked 'em if they's gwine to grab a young white gentleman's property and get a hidin' for it. Then I gin 'em 10 cents apiece, and they is mighty well satisfied, and wished some more rafts 'd come along and make 'em rich again. They's mighty good to me, these niggers is, and whatever I wants 'em to do for me, I don't have to ask 'em twice, honey. That Jack's a good nigger, and pretty smart." "Yes, he is. He ain't ever told me you was here. Told me to come, and he'd show me a lot of water moccasins. If anything happens, he ain't mixed up in it. He can say he never seen us together, and it'll be the truth." I don't want to talk much about the next day. I reckon I'll cut it pretty short. I waked up about dawn and was a-going to turn over and go to sleep again, when I noticed how still it was. Didn't seem to be anybody stirring. That warn't usual. Next, I noticed that Buck was up and gone. Well, I gets up a-wonderin' and goes downstairs. Nobody around, everything as still as a mouse. Just the same outside. Thinks I, what does it mean? Down by the woodpile, I comes across my Jack and says, "What's it all about?" Says he, "Don't you know, Mars George?" "No," says I don't." "Well, den, Miss Sophia's run off, 'deed she has. She run off in de night sometime. Nobody don't know just when. Run off to get married to dat young Harney Shepherdson, you know. Leastways so dey spec. De family found it out about half-hour ago, maybe little more, and I tell you dey wa'n't no time lost. Sich another hurrying up guns and horses you never see. De woman folks is gone for to stir up de relations, and old Marse Saul and de boys tuck dey guns and rode up de river road for to try to catch dat young man and kill him 'fore he can get across de river with Miss Sophia. I reckon dey's gwine to be mighty rough times. Buck went off that wake me up. Well, I reckon he did. Dey warn't gwine to mix you up in it. Marse Buck, he loaded up his gun and 'lowed he's gwine to fetch home Shepherdson or bust. Well, there'll be plenty in 'em dere, I reckon, and you bet you he'll fetch one if he gets a chancet. I took up the river road as hard as I could put. By and by, I began to hear guns a good ways off. When I came inside of the log store in the woodpile where the steamboats land, I worked along under the trees and brush till I got to a good place, and then I clumb up into the forks of a cottonwood that was out of reach and watched. There was a wood rank 4 foot high a little ways in front of the tree, and first I was going to hide behind that, but maybe it was luckier I didn't. There was 4 or 5 men cavorting around on their horses in the open place before the log store, cussing and yelling and trying to get at a couple of young chaps that was behind the wood rank alongside of the steamboat landing, but they couldn't come it. Every time one of them showed himself on the riverside of the woodpile, he got shot at. The 2 boys was squatting back to back behind the pile so they could watch both ways. By and by, the men stopped cavorting around and yelling. They started riding towards the store. Then up gets one of the boys, draws a steady bead over the wood rank, and drops one of them out of his saddle. All the men jumped off of their horses and grabbed the hurt one and started to carry him to the store, and that minute the 2 boys started on the run. They got halfway to the tree I was in before the men noticed. Then the men see them, and jumped on their horses and took out after them. They gained on the boys, but it didn't do no good. The boys had too good a start. They got to the woodpile that was in front of my tree and slipped in behind it, and so they had the bulge on the men again. One of the boys was Buck, and the other was a slim young chap, about 19 years old. The men ripped around a while and then rode away. As soon as they was out of sight, I sung out to Buck and told him. He didn't know what to make of my voice coming out of the tree at first. He was awful surprised. He told me to watch out sharp and let him know when the men come in sight again, and said they was up to some devilment or other, wouldn't be gone long. I wished I was out of that tree, but I dasn't come down. Buck begun to cry and rip and 'lowed that him and his cousin Joe, that was the other young chap, would make up for this day yet. He said his father and his 2 brothers was killed, and 2 or 3 of the enemy. Said the Shepherdsons laid for them in ambush. Buck said his father and brothers ought to waited for their relations. The Shepherdsons was too strong for them. I asked him what was become of young Harney and Miss Sophia. He said they got across the river and was safe. I was glad of that, but the way Buck did take on because he didn't manage to kill Harney that day he shot at him, I hain't ever heard anything like it. All of a sudden, bang, 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 goes 3 or 4 guns. The men had slipped around through the woods and come in from behind without their horses. The boys jumped for the river, both of them hurt, and as they swum down the current, the men run along the bank, shooting at them and singing out, "Kill them! Kill them!" It made me so sick I most fell out of the tree. I ain't a-going to tell all that happened. It would make me sick again if I was to do that. I wished I hadn't ever come ashore that night to see such things. I ain't ever going to get shut of them. Lots of times I dream about them. I stayed in the tree till it begun to get dark, afraid to come down. Sometimes I heard guns away off in the woods, and twice I seen little gangs of men gallop past the log store with guns, so I reckoned the trouble was still a-going on. I was mighty downhearted, so I made up my mind I wouldn't ever go near that house again, because I reckoned I was to blame somehow. I judged that piece of paper meant that Miss Sophia was to meet Harney somewheres at 2:30 and run off, and I judged I ought to told her father about that paper and the curious way she acted, and then maybe he would 'a' locked her up and this awful mess wouldn't never happened. When I got down out of the tree, I crept along down the river bank a piece and found the 2 bodies layin' in the edge of the water, and tugged at them till I got them ashore. Then I covered up their faces and got away as quick as I could. I cried a little when I was covering up Buck's face, for he was mighty good to me. It was just dark now. I never went near the house, but struck through the woods and made for the swamp. Jim warn't on his island, so I tramped off in a hurry for the crick and crowded through the willows, red hot to jump aboard and get out of that awful country. The raft was gone. My souls, but I was scared. I couldn't get my breath for most a minute. Then I raised a yell. A voice not 25 foot from me says, "Good land, is that you, honey? Don't make no noise." It was Jim's voice. Nothing ever sounded so good before. I run along the bank a piece and got aboard, and Jim, he grabbed me and hugged me, he was so glad to see me. He says, "Laws bless you, child. I was right down sure you's dead again. Jack's been here. He said he reckons you's been shot 'cause you didn't come home no more. So I was just this minute a-starting the raft down towards the mouth of the crick, so's to be all ready for to shove out and leave, soon as Jack comes again and tells me for certain you is dead. Lawsy, I is mighty glad to get you back again, honey." I says, "All right, that's mighty good. They won't find me, and they'll think I've been killed and floated down the river. There's something up there that'll help them think so. So don't you lose no time, Jim, but just shove off for the big water as fast as ever you can." I never felt easy till the raft was 2 miles below there and out in the middle of the Mississippi. Then we hung up our signal lantern and judged that we was free and safe once more. I hadn't had a bite to eat since yesterday, so Jim, he got out some corn dodgers and buttermilk and pork and cabbage and greens. There ain't nothing in the world so good when it's cooked right, and whilst I eat my supper we talked and had a good time. I was powerful glad to get away from the feuds, and so was Jim to get away from the swamp. We said there warn't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft. End of chapter 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in February 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 19. 2 or 3 days and nights went by. I reckon I might say they swum by. They slid along, so quiet and smooth and lovely. Here's the way we put in the time. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We run nights and laid up and hid daytimes. Soon as night was most gone, we stopped navigating and tied up, nearly always in the dead water under a towhead, and then cut young cottonwoods and willows and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the lines. Next, we slid into the river and had a swim, so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee-deep and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywheres, perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep, only sometimes the bullfrogs a-clutterin' maybe. The first thing to see looking away over the water was a kind of dull line. That was the woods on the other side. You couldn't make nothing else out. Then a pale place in the sky. Then more paleness spreadin' around. Then the river softened up a way off and warn't black any more, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you could hear a sweep screaking, or jumbled up voices. It was so still, and sounds come so far, and by you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there's a snag there in the swift current, which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And you see the mist curl up off of the water, and the east reddens up, and the river, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods, away on the bank on the other side of the river, being a wood yard likely, and piled by them cheats so you can throw a dog through it anywheres. Then the nice breeze springs up and comes fanning you from over there, so cool and fresh and sweet to smell on account of the woods and the flowers. But sometimes not that way, because they've left dead fish laying around, gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. And next thing you got the full day, and everything smiling in the sun, and the songbirds just going it. A little smoke couldn't be noticed now, so we would take some fish off of the lines and cook up a hot breakfast, and afterwards we would watch the lonesomeness of the river, and kind of lazy along, and by lazy off to sleep. Wake up by and look to see what done it, and maybe see a steamboat coughing along upstream, so far off towards the other side you couldn't tell nothing about her, only whether she was a stern wheel or side wheel. Then for about an hour there wouldn't be nothing to hear, nor nothing to see, just solid lonesomeness. Next you'd see a raft sliding by, away off yonder, and maybe a galoot on it chopping, because they're most always doing it on a raft. You'd see the axe flash and come down. You don't hear nothing. You see that axe go up again, and by the time it's above the man's head, then you hear the ka-chunk. It had took all that time to come over the water. So we would put in the day, lazying around, listening to the stillness. Once there was a thick fog, and the rafts and things that went by was beating tin pans so the steamboats wouldn't run over them. A scow or a raft went by so close we could hear them talking and cussing and laughing. Heard them plain, but we couldn't see no sign of them. It made you feel crawly. It was like spirits carrying on that way in the air. Jim said he believed it was spirits, but I says, no, spirits wouldn't say, "Durn the dern fog." Soon as it was night out, we shoved. When we got her out to about the middle, we let her alone, and let her float wherever the current wanted her to. Then we lit the pipes, and dangled our legs in the water, and talked about all kinds of things. We was always naked, day and night, whenever the mosquitoes would let us. The new clothes Buck's folks made for me was too good to be comfortable, and besides, I didn't go much on clothes nohow. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, and maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window, and sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two, on a raft or a scow, you know, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them, and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim, he 'lowed they was made, but I 'lowed they happened. I judged it would have took so long to make so many. Jim said the moon could 'a' laid them. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I've seen a frog lay most as many, so of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, and see them streak down. Jim allowed they'd got spoiled, and was hove out of the nest. Once or twice of a night we could see a steamboat slipping along in the dark, and now and then she would belch a whole world of sparks up out of her chimblies, and they would rain down in the river and look awful pretty. Then she would turn a corner, and her lights would wink out, and her powwow shut off and leave the river still again. and by her waves would get to us, a long time after she was gone, and joggle the raft a bit, and after that you wouldn't hear nothing, for you couldn't tell how long, except maybe frogs or something. After midnight the people on shore went to bed, and then for 2 or 3 hours the shores was black, no more sparks in the cabin windows. These sparks was our clock. The first one that showed again meant morning was coming, so we hunted a place to hide and tie up right away. One morning about daybreak I found a canoe and crossed over a chute to the main shore. It was only 200 yards, and paddled about a mile up a creek amongst the cypress woods to see if I couldn't get some berries. Just as I was passing a place where a kind of a cow path crossed the creek, here comes a couple of men tearing up the path as tight as they could foot it. I thought I was a goner, for whenever anybody was after anybody, I judged it was me, or maybe Jim. I was about to dig out from there in a hurry, but they was pretty close to me then, and sung out and begged me to save their lives, said they hadn't been doing nothing and was being chased for it, and there was men and dogs a-comin'. They wanted to jump right in, but I says, "Don't you do it. I don't hear the dogs and horses yet. You've got time to crowd through the brush and get up the creek a little ways. Then you take to the water and wade down to me and get in. That'll throw the dogs off the scent." They done it, and soon as they was aboard, I lit out for our towhead, and in about 5 or 10 minutes we heard the dogs and the men away off shouting. We heard them come along towards the creek, but couldn't see them. They seemed to stop and fool around a while. Then, as we got further and further away all the time, we couldn't hardly hear them at all. And by the time we had left a mile of woods behind us and struck the river, everything was quiet, and we paddled over to the towhead and hid in the cottonwoods and was safe. One of these fellows was about 70 or upwards, and had a bald head and very gray whiskers. He had an old, battered-up slouch hat on, and a greasy blue woolen shirt, and ragged old blue jeans breeches stuffed into his boot tops, and home-knit glasses. No, he only had one. He had an old, long-tailed, blue jeans coat with slick brass buttons flung over his arm, and both of them had big, fat, ratty-looking carpet bags. The other fellow was about 30, and dressed about as ornery. After breakfast we all laid off and talked, and the first thing that come out was that these chaps didn't know one another. "What got you into trouble?" says the bald head to the other chap. "Well, I'd been selling an article to take the tartar off the teeth, and it does take it off, too, and generally the enamel along with it. But I stayed about 1 night longer than I ought to, and was just in the act of sliding out when I ran across you on the trail this side of town, and you told me they were coming, and begged me to help you to get off. So I told you I was expecting trouble myself, and would scatter out with you. That's the whole yarn. What's yourn?" "Well, I'd been a-running a little temperance revival there about a week, and was the pet of the woman folks, big and little, for I was making it mighty warm for the rummies, I tell you, and taking as much as $5 or $6 a night, 10 cents a head, children and niggers free, and business a-growing all the time, when somehow or another a little report got around last night that I had a way of putting in my time with a private jug on the sly. A nigger rousted me out this morning and told me the people was gathering on the quiet with their dogs and horses, and they'd be along pretty soon and give me about half an hour's start, and then run me down if they could, and if they got me they'd tar and feather me and ride me on the rail sure. I didn't wait for no breakfast, I warn't hungry." "Old man," said the young one, "I reckon we might double-team it together. What do you think?" "I ain't undisposed. What's your line, mainly?" "You're a printer by trade. Do a little in patent medicines. Theater actor, tragedy, you know. Take a turn to mesmerism and phrenology when there's a chance. Teach singing geography school for a change. sling a lecture sometimes. Oh, I do lots of things. Most anything that comes handy, so it ain't work. What's your lay?
I've done considerable in the doctorin' way in my time. Layin' on of hands is my best holt, for cancer and paralysis and sich things, and I can tell a fortune pretty good when I've got somebody along to find out the facts for me. Preachin's my line, too, and working camp meetin's and missionaryin' around.
Nobody never said anything for a while, when the young man huv a sigh and says, "Alas!"
"What are you lassin' about?"
says the bald head. "To think I should have lived to be leadin' such a life, and be degraded down into such company." And he begun to wipe the corner of his eye with a rag.
"Durn your skin, ain't the company good enough for you?"
says the bald head, pretty pert and uppish. "Yes, it is good enough for me. It's as good as I deserve, for who fetched me so low when I was so high? I did myself. I don't blame you, gentlemen. Far from it. I don't blame anybody. I deserve it all. Let the cold world do its worst. One thing I know, there's a grave somewhere for me. The world may go on just as it's always done, and take everything from me, loved ones, property, everything, but it can't take that. Some day I'll lie down in it and forget it all, and my poor broken heart will be at rest." He went on a-wiping.
"Drat your poor broken heart," says the bald head. "What are you heaving your poor broken heart at us for? We ain't done nothing."
"No, I know you haven't. I ain't blaming you, gentlemen. I brought myself down. Yes, I did it myself. It's right I should suffer. Perfectly right. I don't make any moan."
"Brought you down from whar? Where was you brought down from?"
You would not believe me. The world never believes. Let it pass. 'Tis no matter. The secret of my birth—"
"The secret of your birth? Do you mean to say—"
"Gentlemen," says the young man, very solemn, "I will reveal it to you, for I feel I may have confidence in you. By rights, I am a duke."
Jim's eyes bugged out when he heard that, and I reckon mine did too. Then the bald head says, "No, you can't mean it."
"Yes, my great-grandfather, eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater, fled to this country about the end of the last century to breathe the pure air of freedom. Married here and died, leaving a son, his own father dying about the same time. The second son of the late Duke seized the titles and estates. The infant real Duke was ignored. I am the lineal descendant of that infant. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater, and here am I, forlorn, torn from my high estate, hunted of men, despised by the cold world, ragged, worn, heartbroken, and degraded to the companionship of felons on a raft." Jim pitied him ever so much, and so did I. We tried to comfort him, but he said it warn't much use. He couldn't be much comforted, and if we was a mind to acknowledge him, that would do him more good than most anything else. So we said we would, if he would tell us how. He said we ought to bow when we spoke to him, and say, "Your Grace," or "My Lord," or "Your Lordship," and he wouldn't mind if we called him plain Bridgewater, which he said was a title anyway, and not a name, and one of us ought to wait on him at dinner and do any little thing for him he wanted done. Well, that was all easy, so we done it. All through dinner Jim stood around and waited on him, and says, "Will your Grace have some of this or some of that?" and so on, and a body could see it was mighty pleasing to him. But the old man got pretty silent by and by, didn't have much to say, and didn't look pretty comfortable over all that petting that was going on around that Duke. He seemed to have something on his mind. So, along in the afternoon, he says, "Looky here, Bilgewater," he says, "I'm nation sorry for you, but you ain't the only person that's had troubles like that." "No? No, you ain't. You ain't the only person that's been snaked down wrongfully out in a high place." "Alas!" "No, you ain't the only person that's had a secret of his birth." And by jings, he begins to cry. "Hold! What do you mean?" "Bilgewater, can I trust you?" says the old man, still sort of sobbing. "To the bitter death." He took the old man by the hand and squeezed it and says, "That secret of your being, speak." "Bilgewater, I am the late Dauphin." You bet you, Jim and me stared this time. Then the Duke says, "You are what?" "Yes, my friend, it is too true. Your eyes is looking at this very moment on the poor disappeared Dauphin, Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI and Mary Antoinette." "You, at your age? No. You mean you're the late Charlemagne. You must be 600 or 700 years old, at the very least." "Trouble has done it, Bilgewater, trouble has done it. Trouble has brung these gray hairs and this premature balditude. Yes, gentlemen, you see before you in blue jeans and misery the wandering, exiled, tramped on, and suffering rightful King of France." Well, he cried and took on so that me and Jim didn't know hardly what to do. We was so sorry, and so glad and proud we'd got him with us, too. So we set in, like we done before with the Duke, and tried to comfort him. But he said it warn't no use. Nothing but to be dead and done with it all could do him any good, though he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while, if people treated him according to his rights, and got down on one knee to speak to him, and always called him Your Majesty, and waited on him first at meals, and didn't sit down in his presence till he asked them. So Jim and me set to majestying him, and doing this and that and the other for him, and standing up till he told us we might sit down. This done him heaps of good, and so he got cheerful and comfortable. But the Duke kind of soured on him, and didn't look a bit satisfied with the way things was going. Still, the king acted real friendly towards him, and said the Duke's great-grandfather and all the other Dukes of Bilgewater was a good deal thought of by his father, and was allowed to come to the palace considerable. But the Duke stayed huffy a good while, till by and by the king says, "Like as not we got to be together a blamed long time on this here raft, Bilgewater, and so what's the use of your being sour? It'll only make things uncomfortable. It ain't my fault I warn't born a Duke. It ain't your fault you warn't born a king, so what's the use to worry? Make the best of things, the way you find 'em, says I. That's my motto. This ain't no bad thing that we struck here. Plenty grub and an easy life. Come, give us your hand, Duke, and let's all be friends." The Duke done it, and Jim and me was pretty glad to see it. It took away all the uncomfortableness, and we felt mighty good over it, because it would have been a miserable business to have any unfriendliness on the raft, for what you want above all things on a raft is for everybody to be satisfied and feel right and kind towards the others. It didn't take me long to make up my mind that these liars weren't no kings nor dukes at all, but just low-down humbugs and frauds. But I never said nothing, never let on. Kept it to myself. It's the best way. Then you don't have no quarrels and don't get into no trouble. If they wanted us to call them kings and dukes, I hadn't no objections, long as it would keep peace in the family. And it warn't no use to tell Jim, so I didn't tell him. If I never learnt nothing else out of Pap, I learnt that the best way to get along with his kind of people is to let them have their own way. End of chapter 19.